Jason Statham was walking through the bustling streets of downtown when a commotion outside a small cafe caught his attention. A disheveled homeless man was being pushed out by a security guard, his red MAGA hat falling to the ground as the guard shouted, "We don't want your kind here." The man bent down to pick up his hat, his hands trembling, while passers-by either ignored the scene or watched silently. Jason's jaw tightened, his steely gaze fixed on the guard. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" What began as a simple act of intervention was about to spiral into an unforgettable moment of justice. Jason Statham approached the cafe with purpose, his piercing eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. The homeless man, frail and visibly shaken, clutched his red MAGA hat like it was his last possession of value. The security guard stood towering over him, his posture aggressive. "I said, get out of here," the guard barked, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "We don't need troublemakers like you hanging around." Jason stepped between the two men, his presence commanding immediate attention. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but full of authority. The guard turned, clearly annoyed. "This doesn't concern you, mate," he snapped. "Move along." Jason's expression hardened. "It concerns me now," he said, gesturing toward the homeless man. "Why are you throwing him out?" The guard scoffed, crossing his arms. "He's loitering, wearing that hat like he's trying to start something. It's bad for business." Jason's gaze didn't waver. "Bad for business, or bad for your bias?" he asked sharply. The onlookers, who had been pretending not to watch, began to murmur amongst themselves. The homeless man looked up at Jason, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "I wasn't doing anything," he said softly. "I just wanted to sit for a minute." Jason turned back to the guard, his tone like steel. "Everyone has the right to sit and rest. That hat doesn't change that." The growing tension outside the cafe quickly caught the attention of passers-by, and a small crowd began to form. At first, people hesitated, their glances fleeting and uncertain as they tried to decide whether to intervene or simply watch. But as Jason Statham's unmistakable presence entered the scene, the onlookers couldn't help but stop and pay attention. "Isn't that Jason Statham?" a man whispered to his wife, nudging her lightly. "Yeah, it is," she replied, her eyes widening. "What's he doing here? Is that a homeless guy he's helping?" The couple's curiosity was echoed by others in the crowd, their murmurs growing louder as the confrontation between Jason and the security guard unfolded. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the exchange, while others whispered to one another, speculating about what was happening. "He's standing up for that guy," said a teenager holding a skateboard. "Man, that's pretty cool." But not everyone in the crowd was supportive. A woman near the back crossed her arms and frowned. "Why is he getting involved?" she muttered to her friend. "The guard's just doing his job." Her friend shrugged uncomfortably. "Maybe," she said, "but it doesn't feel right to throw someone out just because of a hat." Jason, overhearing snippets of the crowd's conversations, didn't let it distract him. His focus remained firmly on the security guard, whose bravado was beginning to falter under the weight of the growing audience. The guard shifted uneasily, glancing at the onlookers and then back at Jason. "Look," the guard said, his tone defensive now, "I'm just trying to keep things under control. We've had issues with people like him before." "People like him?" Jason repeated, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" The guard stammered, clearly caught off guard by the question. "I mean, people loitering, causing trouble. It's bad for the business." Jason raised an eyebrow, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "He wasn't causing trouble. He was sitting quietly, minding his own business. The only disturbance here is the way you're treating him." A young woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward hesitantly. "He's right," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've seen that man around. He's never bothered anyone. This isn't fair." Her words seemed to embolden others. A middle-aged man spoke up from the side. Yeah, I've seen him too, he said. He's not a problem. Why kick him out? The tide of public opinion was beginning to turn, and the guard could feel it. He glanced nervously at the crowd, now larger and more vocal. A few people began nodding in agreement, while others whispered quietly, their earlier hesitation replaced by a growing sense of unease about the situation. Meanwhile, the homeless man, Ronald, stood silently, clutching his red MAGA hat to his chest. His eyes darted between Jason and the guard, a mix of fear and hope flickering in his expression. For months, he had endured these kinds of confrontations alone, ignored by passers-by who pretended not to see him. But now, someone was standing up for him, someone who wasn't just watching, but taking action. Jason turned to the crowd, his voice rising slightly. "We all see what's happening here," he said, addressing them directly. "The question is, are we just going to watch, or are we going to do something about it?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the group. The teenager with the skateboard stepped closer, his voice louder now. "He's right. This isn't cool. The guy's not doing anything wrong." The security guard's confidence crumbled further as more people began to speak out. A man near the door folded his arms and frowned. "Throwing someone out for sitting quietly? That's not how you treat people." Even those who had initially stayed silent began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier indifference giving way to quiet agreement. The guard finally threw up his hands, his frustration evident. "Fine," he muttered. "Let him stay. But if anything happens..." Jason cut him off, his tone firm. "Nothing's going to happen except you learning a lesson about respect." The crowd erupted into quiet applause, their admiration for Jason's courage beginning to outweigh their earlier hesitation. Ronald looked up at Jason, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thank you," he said softly. Jason placed a reassuring hand on Ronald's shoulder. "Don't thank me," he said. "You deserve to be treated with dignity, just like anyone else." The energy in the crowd shifted further, the earlier whispers replaced with murmurs of support and approval. Some people even approached the cafe to offer Ronald kind words or small gestures of encouragement. The once tense atmosphere had transformed into a moment of collective reflection, all sparked by Jason's unwavering determination to do what was right. The security guard, visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The murmurs from the growing crowd only seemed to heighten his unease. He glanced around, clearly searching for support or a way to regain control of the situation. "Look, fine," he muttered, his tone defensive. "If he just wants to sit, let him sit. But if he causes any trouble..." Jason raised a hand, cutting him off. His voice, calm but authoritative, carried easily over the noise. "He's not the one causing trouble," he said, his piercing gaze locking onto the guard. "The only trouble here is your attitude." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Jason's words. The teenager with the skateboard took a step closer, his voice louder now. "Yeah, he's right. The guy's just sitting there. Why kick him out?" The guard shot the boy an annoyed look but said nothing. His confidence was unraveling, and he seemed to realize that continuing to argue would only make things worse for him. Jason turned back to Ronald, who was still clutching his red MAGA hat tightly to his chest. "Come on," Jason said gently, gesturing toward the cafe. "Let's get you something to eat." Ronald hesitated, glancing at the guard and the crowd before looking back at Jason. I don't want to cause any more problems," he said softly. "You're not causing problems," Jason replied firmly. "You're just trying to live your life. That's not a problem, that's your right." Slowly, Ronald nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he allowed Jason to guide him back toward the cafe entrance. The onlookers parted to let them through, their murmurs now filled with admiration and curiosity. Inside the cafe, the cashier looked up, startled to see Jason Statham approaching the counter with Ronald by his side. Can I help you?" the cashier asked nervously. "Yes, you can," Jason said, his tone polite but firm. "I'd like to buy him whatever he wants to eat." And make sure he's treated with the same respect you'd give anyone else who walks through that door. The cashier hesitated, glancing at the security guard lingering outside before nodding quickly. "Of course, Mr. Statham," he said, his voice almost trembling. "Right away." Jason turned to Ronald, his expression softening. "What do you feel like eating?" he asked. Ronald blinked, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Just a sandwich and some coffee," he said quietly. Jason nodded. "Make it 2 sandwiches and a large coffee," he told the cashier. "And add some pastries for later." As the cashier rang up the order, the murmurs outside grew louder. The cafe's patrons, many of whom had been pretending not to notice the earlier commotion, were now fully engaged in the scene unfolding before them. "Is he really buying that guy food?" a woman near the window whispered. "Yeah," her companion replied, her tone tinged with awe. "And he's doing it like it's no big deal." When the food was ready, Jason carried the tray to a small table near the back of the cafe. Ronald sat down hesitantly, his movements slow and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there. "You're safe here," Jason said reassuringly. "Eat. Take your time." Ronald looked up at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jason pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one deserves to be treated like you were out there." Ronald nodded, his throat tightening with emotion as he took a bite of his sandwich. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, the security guard hovered near the entrance, his earlier bravado completely gone. He watched the scene inside, his expression a mix of frustration and embarrassment as the crowd outside continued to grow. Jason caught sight of the guard through the glass door. He stood up, walked to the entrance, and opened the door just enough to address him. "If you're going to stand there," Jason said, his voice firm but even, "use the time to think about how you can treat people better next time." The guard didn't respond, his face flushing as the crowd behind him erupted and scattered applause. Jason didn't wait for an answer. He returned to the table where Ronald sat, now smiling faintly as he finished his meal. "You're not just feeding him," a woman in the cafe said softly as Jason passed by. "You're teaching everyone here something important." Jason paused and gave her a small nod. "It's not about making a scene," he said. "It's about setting an example." Ronald looked up from his plate, his gratitude evident in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a problem, but as a person. As Ronald slowly ate his meal, Jason sat across from him, watching the man's tension gradually ease. It was clear from Ronald's posture and the way he hesitated before each bite that he wasn't used to this kind of kindness. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, and his eyes darted around the cafe, as if he still expected someone to tell him he didn't belong. Jason leaned forward, his tone calm and encouraging. "Take your time," he said. "You're safe here." Ronald nodded, swallowing hard before setting his sandwich down. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't even know what to say. It's been so long since anyone's treated me like a person." Jason frowned slightly, the weight of Ronald's words hitting him. "No one should make you feel less than human," he said. "Everyone has a story." "What's yours, Ronald?" Ronald hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the MAGA hat still clutched tightly in his lap. "It's not much of a story," he said after a moment. "Just bad luck, I guess." Jason shook his head. "Doesn't sound like bad luck to me," he said. "Sounds like there's more to it." Ronald sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I used to work in construction," he began. "Good, honest work. I had a steady job, a little place to call my own. Nothing fancy, but it was enough." He paused, his voice tightening. "Then the company downsized, and I was one of the first to go. They said it wasn't personal, but when you're left with nothing, it sure feels personal." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "What happened after that?" Ronald ran a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion and hardship etched deeply into his features. I tried to find work, he said. But every time I showed up for an interview, it felt like they'd already made up their minds about me before I even opened my mouth. He glanced down at his hat. I started wearing this because it made me feel like I still stood for something. Like I wasn't invisible. Jason's gaze softened as he looked at the worn red cap in Ronald's hands. And people judged you for it, he said. Ronald nodded. All the time, he said, his voice cracking. It's like the hat turned me into a target. People yelled at me on the street, told me I didn't belong. I lost count of how many places turned me away just because of this. He tightened his grip on the hat. But I can't stop wearing it. It's the only thing that makes me feel like I have some kind of strength left. Jason leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. It's not the hat that's the problem, he said. It's the way people let their assumptions define how they treat you. Ronald blinked, surprised by the conviction in Jason's voice. You really think so? He asked. I know so, Jason replied firmly. And you've got more strength than you realize, Ronald. Most people would have given up a long time ago, but you're still here. That says a lot. Ronald's eyes filled with tears, though he quickly wiped them away. I don't feel strong, he admitted. Most days, I don't even feel like I'm worth anything. Jason leaned forward again, his tone steady but filled with compassion. Listen to me, he said. You're worth more than you know. And it's not about what other people see, it's about what you do next. You've made it this far. That's proof you've got what it takes to keep going. The cafe grew quieter as more patrons began to notice the conversation taking place at the back table. Some looked on with quiet respect, while others appeared thoughtful, as if reflecting on their own assumptions and actions. Jason glanced at the people watching and then back at Ronald. You're not alone anymore, he said. We'll figure this out. Ronald's lip quivered as he looked down at his empty plate. I don't even know where to start, he said. Jason smiled faintly. That's okay, he said. We'll take it one step at a time. For now, you focus on getting back on your feet. The rest will come. As Ronald nodded slowly, the tension in his face began to ease. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to believe that things might actually get better. And for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a problem, but as a person deserving of dignity and respect. As Ronald ate, Jason made a few discreet calls. By the time they finished their meal, a representative from a local shelter had arrived, ready to help Ronald find a safe place to stay. Ronald, Jason said, standing up, this is just the start. You've been through a lot, but things can get better. I'll make sure of it. Ronald looked up at Jason, his eyes brimming with gratitude. Why are you doing this? He asked. Jason smiled faintly. Because I believe in standing up for what's right, he said. And because everyone deserves a second chance. The security guard, who had been lingering nearby, approached awkwardly. Mr. Statham, he said hesitantly, I'm sorry. I didn't handle this the right way. Jason's gaze softened slightly. It's not about me, he said. It's about treating people with dignity. Remember that. Conclusion. Word of Jason's actions spread quickly, with onlookers sharing the story online. The cafe issued an apology and promised to improve its policies to ensure everyone was treated fairly. As for Ronald, he began his journey toward rebuilding his life, with Jason quietly supporting him behind the scenes. For Jason, it wasn't about recognition, it was about proving that kindness and courage can make a real difference, one act at a time.